Everybody, let's have a seat. We'll go ahead and get started. It's almost 9:30. All right, Ray, we're good to go. You can start the recording as well. Good. All right. Well, good morning and welcome to Calvary Chapel. We're glad you're here. This is our second session of Apologetics. Last night we did an introduction on worldview and talked about just those big pictures of does God exist? And took a look at both the philosophical and some mathematician kinds of approaches to how to respond to folks about origins. And today, when we think about apologetics, you know, we're always thinking from the standpoint of apologetics talks about in 1 Peter 3:15 about being able to give a reasoned argument or a logical defense for the hope that's within you. And this is a shot up on the Areopagus, just south of the Acropolis in Athens, Greece. That's where Paul went up and had his apologetic, if you will, debate with the Stoics and Epicureans regarding the unknown God. And we want to have that kind of ability to give a good defense, have good reasoned arguments, not shout at each other, because obviously the other side does not agree with us. And they also view us as, you know, this terrible pea-brain mindset and how you view things, and it's not scientific or something. So there's already a gap between us. What we want to do is have the ability to have a good conversation, and we want to equip you with some tools and responses you can have for those who ask questions about your faith. And so today we'll dovetail a little bit with two of the books in the Apologetics series on origins of the universe, origins of life on earth. My two colleagues who are with me today are Dr. Travis Dickinson from Dallas Baptist University. He's a professor of philosophy and apologetics there. And then Dr. Todd Von Helms, who is a presidential scholar at Dallas Baptist University for Christianity and culture, and also at Montreat University and also at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. Does a lot of writing, a lot of speaking, and you might recognize his name. He did the foreword for all the books in the Apologetics series. You'll see at the bottom, foreword by Dr. Todd Von Helms. So glad to have them with us. This is session 2. Our third session will be tomorrow evening on looking at the historical Jesus. But enough. Let's get into today's topic, which is the ladies are currently studying Genesis on Thursday mornings with Debbie, and we thought it'd be great to talk about, is Genesis factual history? Or is it just myth and legend and, just kind of metaphor, and it's not intended to be read literally? What do you think about that? Travis, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I think that, right, this is, of course, of vital importance. I mean, it starts the book, it starts the Bible, and how one approaches these things, I think, in some ways, kind of sets the rest of the story, right? So whether or not it's history, whether or not it's myth, or whether or not it's some combination, because I don't think we're locked into either or here. But right when we sort of focus in on particular issues within Genesis, should it be read as literal history? Because if it is, it makes a big difference. I think I'll say this towards the end, but I think it really sets us up in a very literal way for the gospel, right? It gives some of the bad news. So that we can get to the good news. Yeah.
Todd, what do you think?
Yeah, so I grew up in a public school. Maybe many of you did as well. And there's just one consensus there. And that is, the thing with the earth being the billions of years old. And, you're made to, you're belittled if you question that or challenge that. Or at least that's how I thought about it. And then, you go to church and you read the Bible and you see this different account, this narrative in Genesis. And, as time has passed and I've looked back on it, I thought, well, I'm standing at the Grand Canyon and I'm looking at these rocks and I'm looking at, these markers that are saying, the millions of years and the hundreds of millions and all that. And then I'm thinking, then there's the Bible. And in my mind, I'm like, well, why even question? Those seem to be mutually exclusive. And, you don't, science is here and you've got the geology and that, and then you've got the Bible here. And when you go back to what was called higher textual criticism in Germany, back around the time that Darwin, he had read a guy named Charles Lyell who had these charts and that, and then influenced Darwin's thinking and his charts with evolution and all that. These higher critics, these critics of the New Testament, really what they were getting at is if we can debunk the record of Genesis 1 through 3, then hopefully we can debunk Christianity.
Yes.
And the whole thing can crumble. So one of the reasons why I'm so excited to be here today and to be part of this and what Dave is up to and to have invited us to come along in that is to just give you a different picture in view of that, to see, are they compatible? Is just random molecules that just, this planet Earth is just floating along, just a speck of dust on a speck of dust in the galaxy of other planets and that? Or is there something unique, and is there really a creator behind all of this, but each one of us as well? So hopefully that's what you're going to hear today. So Dave, I'm going to let you get into this because I've heard that planet Earth is the only planet that we know of that can sustain human life. Now, some would argue and say that cockroaches and bacteria can survive anywhere, but let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and one of the top topics that comes up all the time is, which is interesting because even within Christian circles, there are Christian theistic evolutionists who will say that our presentation today is wrong because they're going to say that when we say things like design and being finely tuned, those are two big terms that we like to use because the evidence we look at seems to be that the Earth is designed and it seems to be finely tuned specifically for life. They just toss that out and they say, oh, those aren't valid ways of looking at the data. But think about it. Look at this planet. 71% water, 97% is in the oceans, an average temperature, mean temperature 59 degrees. We have this certain axis tilt, this beautiful blue atmosphere, 21% oxygen, 78% nitrogen. It looks like it was designed to have life here. Virtually all the other planets that are out there are just bombarded by solar radiation. But this one planet has these Van Allen belts that shield it from solar radiation. And we also have a stratosphere that protects us from ozone. We have this moon that's exactly 1/4 the size of our planet, perfectly positioned in sync with the rotation. And what does it do? It basically, it synchronizes our rotation, moderates our axis at 23-degree tilt. It monitors all our day and evening and our 24-hour days, and it completely is in charge of our tides, of our oceans. And go stand at the Pacific sometime, and the water doesn't, in the morning, come up and go all the way into the mountains and flood everybody. It just stays right at its edge. And it's an amazing concept. And yet, without the moon, there's no life on our planet. And yet this moon is just sitting out there, and it doesn't rotate. It rotates in sync with the planet. Some of the other specs on our planet just seem that it's designed for life. I mean, look at some of these. These are basic scientific facts. If you go in just 900,000 miles closer, which is about less than 1% closer in, all life is over because temperatures on the planet soar and our atmosphere evaporates and there's no air to breathe or anything. You go out, you come in just a little further out, less than 1%, about 875,000 miles, and it gets so cold that the oceans freeze and there's no life. So in that little tiny range, the Earth is sitting perfectly to sustain life. Perfect gravity, stable mean level temperatures. We have green chlorophyll and CO2 cycles with oxygen. We have a water table that continually recycles. Again, 73% of the planet is water. 97% of that water is saline. And yet there's a cycle with the clouds that allows it to come up and come back down to the Earth as fresh water. And it's an amazing thing. We're in a safety zone away from asteroids, and the sun is the perfect age and temperature, perfect distance to just sustain life. Let's take a look at our neighbor just a little closer in. Anybody want to live there? 900 degrees, it would melt lead on the surface. That's how hot it is, okay?
Maybe all right for sun tanning, but...
Yeah, and the atmosphere is carbon dioxide and sulfuric acid. Take a big gulp of that, right? And yet up until about, 1845, 1850, scientists believed it was probably one of the most likely planets to have life on it because of its proximity to Earth and where it was positioned. Go a little further out, our other planet, our other neighbor further out is Mars. And again, carbon dioxide and argon for their atmosphere. Do you know there are 43,000 craters on Mars that are at least 3 miles across? I mean, the place has just been bombarded. And there's no water, it's only frozen CO2. And again, there's no life there. There's all kinds of theories you'll read about that, it used to be life and all these things, but, and then look at our planet. I mean, think about this, guys, right? We have all this fresh water. We have 73,000 different species of trees. We have between 2,000 and 20,000 different species or / varieties of fruits, Okay. We have between 3,000 and 20,000 varieties or species of vegetables. We have close to 400,000 different types of flora and fauna that grow, all different flowers on all kinds of plants and everything like that. Some of you are saying, not in my garden, right? Difficulty getting those going, right? And then look at this is, again, the scientific data. This is what's on our planet. About 2.1 million different types of species. Over 1 million of those are insects. Think about that. Almost half the planet is insects. 36,000 fish, 11,000 reptiles, 11,000 birds, 6,500 mammals. I mean, it's just phenomenal. And yet, here's what's interesting. The other side, the skeptic, will say, well, this is proof of evolution, because look at all the diversity that came out of evolution. And can you see how your lens of worldview changes that? I view this diversity as the miracle of creation, of just so much. I mean, who's the God that came up with all of this diversity? And yet they're going to say, oh, that's the proof of evolution, because you have so many different types of things that evolved from, one beginning. And so, I mean, what do you think about our planet when you think about it? Is it designed? Is it finely tuned?
Todd's got some
Todd's
No,
got
I
some
was
stuff?
just going to say, so Dave, listening to you, watching this, of course I'm biased, but trying to be objective. So you're saying there may be some grand designer or artist behind it all.
Yeah.
Okay, so Travis, what would the implications of that be, or what are the expectations if there is this grand designer, this creator God behind all this?
Yeah, I think this is, so one of the things that I think is important to say is there really is data here that I think can be hard to grapple with a little bit, right? So when somebody, I always tell my students and even my kids and our students in our church, you might find yourself in a classroom and evolutionary biology, and they're laying out evidence, like you're going to see evidence. But for me, it's really like when you back up and you ask these big questions, like we said last night, that I think that the biggest gap, the biggest problem in some ways with the sort of naturalist, atheistic view is how did all of this get here? Like, and I don't even just mean all the diversity of life. I mean, that's an issue for sure too, but how did just life get here? How did reality get here? How did the universe get here? Why was there a Big Bang? And I think that's something that can't be answered. And so if you start with that kind of the biggest question of all in a way, then the question is, what's the story that makes best sense of all the data? And that's where I think Christianity just shines, because when you ask, as Dave will present more and more of these things that will exercise our minds and data and figures and so on, it's just extraordinary. And then what's the implications then is, are we living in an accord with that? Right? Because if God exists, it's the total game changer.
And if he doesn't, so we then have to just continue to adhere to the consensus in the academy, which has been this naturalistic, evolutionary development, and axioms is what they're called.
Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, there's really six major ones. And Dave, I mean, you studied this in great detail. Mm-hmm. Let's maybe do a refresher of those axioms, and what do you think about them? Are they valid? Is there any validity to any of them, or is it just,
Well, we'll get to those in a second. I think a good place to start is I've been doing a new thing the last 15 or 20 years or so, is reading Genesis in reverse. Okay, start in chapter 50 and move toward chapter 1. And when you do that, it looks something like this. From chapter 50 to chapter 9, it's all real people. And they have ages in years, and they're married to different folks, and they have sons and daughters, and they have descendants. And you read all about this account, and then there's all these real places. Remember, this isn't Shangri-La, it's not Atlantis, it's not Middle Earth. It's places like Mount Ararat. It's places like the Red Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, Assyria, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Mount Seir, Mount Ararat, Edom, Canaan, Philistia. I mean, these are all real places. So you read Genesis and you say, oh, it's not allegory, it's real, it's real, it's real. So you start in chapter 50 and go all the way to chapter 9 in reverse, and it's nothing but literal reality, real people, real families, real ages, real places, real kingdoms, etc. Then you come to chapters 8, 7, and 6, and all of a sudden it's not real. Just like that, it switches because it talks about a global flood. And everybody just says, well, there couldn't have been that. That's a fanciful story. And then you get to Genesis 5, and then people sometimes switch back and go, but now we're back to real people again. But then there's others who will look at Adam through Noah and say, those are not individuals who had a son, who had a son, who had a son. Those are clans or people groups with a name on them, and each of them represents anywhere from 100,000 to 300,000 years of the Adam people, the Lamech people, the Methuselah point, going backwards. And then you have chapter 4, Adam, Eve, their two kids, Cain and Abel, and we're being told that Eve is a type of all women, and that she represents, and you have all this metaphor going in. She's not a literal person. Genesis 3, temptation, sin, and the curse, nobody wants to go with that one as being literal. So immediately that's all just, well, that's religion, and I don't believe in religion, so that's she ate the poison apple. And you're always like, no, that's Disney, okay? that's where the queen comes up in a disguise and gets Snow White to eat the poison apple. Okay, we're not talking about, the poison apple, okay? This is a decision about exercising free will and knowing what it is to disobey God. And so then you finally come to chapters 2 and 1, and then you really have people say, well, none of that can be literal, that God created the heavens and the earth and all the diversity that we see and created people, and all of a sudden the oceans were teeming with life and the sky was filled with birds and the animals were all over. We just saw there's 2.1 million different species of animals on the planet. 6,500 mammals, 11,000 fish, 11,000 different types of birds. And we have 3 different camps out there. One is that it all evolved, so you didn't have all those numbers until billions of years went by. It all started with little microbes who had mutations randomly over time and created all this diversity, which is a really hard thing. Last night, I think, when you saw some of the numbers I showed in terms of 10 to the 75th power, 10 to the 65th power, I mean, the probabilities of those things happening are just absurd. And yet, suddenly we're down to here, and the cosmos, the sun, the moon, the earth, the plants, the animals, man and woman, not created. And now we need a evolutionary humanistic narrative to somehow come in alongside Scripture. That's called theistic evolution. Or we have to have something that replaces it completely, which is science. Okay? And science is the only thing that can actually give an explanation for this. What are your thoughts about that? Todd?
No, that's kind of what I was thinking about the science and that, because in my mind, I still see these graphs and these things where, Darwin had come up with, and, and again, it's all theory, but yet it's been accepted as being fact.
Right.
And, I remember, visiting a church one time when I was a kid, and someone said, oh, you don't really believe dinosaurs lived, do you? And just, there's just so much out there, and, it's just not taboo, whatever, to talk about certain things. Like you're made to think that they're not compatible, or it has to be science over here, your belief in God, theology over here. And that's why I brought that up earlier, just this whole thing of these axioms. I mean, it's just, I think it's important to analyze them and even provide that critique. And
we will.
Yeah, and the people caught in the middle of just saying, this is completely new to me. I mean, it doesn't Adam mean man?
Yeah.
But that's the first man?
Yeah.
So maybe because of that, you could see how someone would go, oh, well, maybe that is mankind, and it is a metaphor. Speak to that a little bit.
Well, I think what I'd like to do is actually jump over to Travis, put you on the spot right now, because Travis, coming from a philosophical standpoint, he has a really nice take on this idea. What would the expectations be? What's reasonable, logical, rational? What would you expect from an all-powerful God?
Yeah, I think that we forget that sometimes, right? When we're looking at this scientific evidence and we're saying, no way that happened. Really? I mean, we're talking about an all-powerful God. So sometimes, in my dialogues with, various ones, maybe somebody who's sort of rejected the faith at some point or whatever, and they'll say something like, yeah, I just got to the point where I just couldn't believe in the bearded guy in the sky anymore. And I always want to say, well, I don't believe in the bearded guy in the sky either. Like, we're on the same, we're rejecting the same view there. But the question is, so there's a theological question that I think should really drive this. Again, that's why I say, for me, the starting place is, does God exist? And what sort of God, right, do we hold to? What is he like? Because if we believe, so I say it's like this game changer. It's like a philosophical or worldview game changer if God exists, because so many other things sort of fall into place this way. And then the question is just, what's the right story about God? And I think the Christian story is the right story, of course. But if we're coming to something like, I remember I had in grad school, I had a guy ask me, saying something like, do you really believe Jonah was swallowed by a big fish, lived in his belly for a few days, and so on? And my response there was just to say, I believe in an all-powerful God, so if that's what God wanted to do, then there's no problem with that. There's no exact objection if God's all-powerful. And so the theistic evolutionists and various others who are really being driven by the science, and I fear that sometimes, and I don't just mean the theistic evolution, I think we can all sort of fall into this mistake at times where we just say, I don't know if that happened. I don't know if this happened over here. But notice how that changes if we have the lens that we're talking about a God who can do anything, anything logically possible. God could bring it about that Jonah miraculously, supernaturally is swallowed and lived. Even if we try to give a kind of way in which he could have survived in there with a little bit of air, I don't know what else going on in the belly of the fish, but right, we could try to give that, but why not just say God just supernaturally caused that to happen, and we don't really know much more than that, right? And I think that's a very respectable, rational view, because again, we're walking into it with that lens that it's an all-powerful God. So bringing the universe, so here's the mistake that I think somebody, theistic evolutionists will make this sort of mistake, I would suggest, is they're okay with a God that can bring all of reality into existence, but not okay to say that God created specially at these different points throughout history. They're going to be just driven by the science on that. And I think that's a big problem. I think that's a big biblical problem, if that makes sense. What I would say, and I actually have a book project in mind. It's just no words on the page yet, even. So, but a book project in mind is to say that I found this with many objections to Christianity and many objections to theism. The issue is that our God is too small. Trying to solve the problem of evil, right? Oftentimes we're thinking of a God that I think is just too small. We're saying, well, God wouldn't do that. God wouldn't bring about a world in which, there's pain and suffering. Well, I think that's a too small God problem. I think that right. In other words, we try to put him in a little box, and when something happens that steps outside of that box, I think that's where I think we have to have a big view of God just to say, I don't know why. I don't know why there's pain and suffering like there is in the world. But God does. Like that, I just have a big view of God such that I think he has reasons. I think he has the end from the beginning in mind, and he's working his plan of salvation, and he's bigger than that, such that he's bigger than our suffering. He's bigger than our expectations. He's even bigger, if I could say it this way, he's bigger than our theology. Again, we try to put him in this little box, right? And this helps a lot when we begin to look at things like science to say, well, why would God create this thing or that thing? Or if it's God, like, why would he do that? I had a professor that would always sort of beat up on the Christians a little bit by making reference to unintelligent design. And so his example of that one day was this microbe. I don't remember the details exactly, but I think it's in the water in South America, and if you ingest it in some way, it'll grow inside of you and like eat you from the inside out. Terrifying. Okay, right. And he said, look at that unintelligent design. And I always want to think, well, that's pretty intelligent. I mean, that's pretty crazy. I don't know how that works, but it seems pretty. Now, the problem with that is that I think, again, it like goes against what our expectations would be for what God would bring about and what God would create. But I think we just have to have a bigger God than that to just say, I don't understand. And that's like part of the picture. One of my favorite verses in the Bible is 1 Corinthians 13:12, which says, right, 1 Corinthians 13 is the love chapter, but it has this really beautiful passage right at the end of it where Paul says that our sort of knowledge of the world is like seeing through a glass dimly or darkly, right? Actually, a little language there is a mirror, trying to see in a mirror dimly. And a mirror in the first century, like a lot of our translators don't use the word mirror there because our mirrors are really beautiful and we see exactly, ourselves in them, which is sometimes a problem. But anyway, right? But in the first century, the mirrors would be all obscured. You kind of barely can make out yourself in this mirror, and that's what Paul's saying is what our knowledge of the world is like. But he gives this promise of one day knowing in full and being fully known. And I just think that's such a beautiful picture, but let's remember that we see through a glass dimly now. It's like seeing in this obscured mirror now. So of course our knowledge is going to be limited. That's why I think we just sort of blow God up as big as possible, and if it feels a little absurd, then you're probably getting close, right? Yeah. You're probably on the right track in some ways, because it should blow up all of our categories.
And think just for a second.
I was just going to say, Travis, real quick. So It sounds like, based on that passage of Scripture and what, it requires humility.
Humility,
and you mentioned that God's bigger than your theology.
Huge.
Which by implication would mean God would have to be bigger than the science that we're using to try to explain who God may be or is as well.
Yeah.
Right? And then with the science, there are the theories.
Yeah.
And so which one, after examining the evidence, might be more believable. So let's look at some of those.
Humility is the name of the game. I mean, in so many ways. Like, and when someone says, "I've got it all figured out," this is, I just think that's already a problem, right? Intellectual humility, ironically, is the way to find truth. Just understanding how little we actually know, and pursuing that with this humility to say, "This is kind of how I understand it. Here I am so far." That's the name of the game.
Well, I would also just say, just take 5 seconds right now and look at this. Yeah. I mean, how many of us look at that and go, "Oh yeah, that's a screensaver developed somewhere or something," This is a view from Hubble looking out into space. And you say to yourself, the evolutionist says that it all evolved. The naturalist worldview says there's no God, there's no intent, all this is just happened. And we would look at it and say, this redefines the word awesome.
Yeah, God's showing off.
Yeah, he's showing off. And this is like one of the slides leading up to the really good stuff. And you think to yourself, you can look at this and either treat it as that's natural, or you can look at it and say, boy, look at the expectations we should have on an all-powerful God. So there are probably arguably 20 axioms. We don't have time to do 20. I was originally going to do 6, but I threw a 7th one in real quickly. But these are things, and we'll just do them very fast, but these are things that are in the science books, and they are still taught and generally accepted as science. They're generally accepted as, these are the pillars of how science works. And so the first one here is interesting. On the left-hand side is the actual hand-drawn tree of evolution that Charles Darwin drew in the late 19th century. And the one on the right is what it's morphed into in typical textbooks on science. And just ask yourself for a moment, this tree over here, you could do that in PowerPoint. You could do that in Illustrator. You could do that in Adobe, whatever program. Just start dropping in pictures and draw different colors and everything. The one on the left is what Darwin actually drew, and by his own admission, he actually said, I had no basis for it. It was just a sketch. I was trying to think about how natural selection might have different variations of different species over time. But look what it's turned into, And the average 17-year-old, 15-year-old, 22-year-old, 9-year-old who's subjected to this will read it and say, oh, yeah, that's how it works. That's where we come from. This is our ancestry. Up in the upper left-hand corner is the classic photo in the beginning of all anthropology books, right? And on the far left is the chimps, and the far right is you and I. And there's all these supposed intermediate stages. We have Neanderthals, we have Cro-Magnon man, we have Homo sapien. You do understand these aren't photos, right? These are drawings by an artist, okay? Some of you are going, oh, they aren't photos? Okay. So they take a skull, they take a bone, they take a tooth, and they develop Piltdown man. Read up on Piltdown man sometime from Piltdown, England, finding just one little shred in a oil digging exploration, and they built an entire reference about another person. Or Lucy, and found some bones in Africa, and suddenly a big, amazing find for anthropology and science. We now have our missing link. And the problem is there are no links in between. There are no intermediate species. There are apes and gorillas, and there are human beings. But there's nothing in between that are these intermediate stages that get to humans. How about the geologic table, a third axiom that's out there? Nicholas Steno was the first one to take a shot at it. James Hutton and Charles Lyell, two Scottish naturalists. By the way, they were called naturalists in their days because that's what they were about. Remember, their bias in all their science was there is no God. And they were looking for a way to refute the idea that there's a God. And what they finally decided on, we need a lot more time because then things could happen naturally. Now, last night I showed a lot of evidence that there isn't enough time. If you were here last night, there's 4.523 times 10 to the 17th seconds in 13.8 billion years. And all these probabilities are much larger than 10 to the 17th. So there's not even enough time for the 1 in 10 to the 67th chance to even happen. And so when you think about this, how many of you had a geology class somewhere, right, in college or something, and you went to the third page of the opening chapter, and there's a geologic table. And, oh, look at that, the Cenozoic period and the Mesozoic period, the Cretaceous, Jurassic, Triassic periods, the Permian. Look at the Pleistocene era and everything, and the Proterozoic. And these are all plugged in. Look at these numbers on the right-hand side. They were all made up. I mean, what was the science like in 1780 during the colonial period in England when these Scottish writers were doing? They had no evidence on any of these things. I always say to myself, why is it, look on the far right, why is the Miocene 23.7 million years instead of 23.5 million years? Or 23.6 million years? Do you realize a 0.6 is 600,000 years? Yeah. And where did these numbers come from?
It's like they flipped a coin or something.
Exactly. I mean, these are all made up, and yet they're in the textbooks today, and they're presented as, oh, this is what we know. In fact, rocks, when we find them, oh, they all have to fit somewhere in here. We know exactly how old they are. Well, that's a problem with radiometric dating. Remember, radiometric dating has three core assumptions. Number one, you have to know how much carbon was in the original starting point. Number two, you have to make the assumption that the decay rate over time is constant and never changes. And number three, there can be absolutely no outside interference of any other things that would corrupt that sample. It would have to be done in a lab. And so they have these rocks where we don't know what the original level of carbon was. We don't know for certain that it's a fixed rate of decay. We think we know. And then we certainly can't say that anything else impacted it over time. And so you end up with, on the left-hand side, highlighted in yellow, these are actual fact. They know how old the rocks are. My favorite one is, I was in college in 1980 when Mount St. Helens blew. You probably all remember that. 13 years later, it had a massive lava dome that had created there in the explosion area. And they went in and they took a look at some of the rock in the lava dome and blindly sent it off without any statement where it came from. They sent it off to 3 different labs to have it radiometric dated. And it came back between 340,000 and 2.8 million years. That alone, I mean, we like to chuckle at it and we like to say, how crazy, but that's what we're looking at. And there's some stuff in Sicily, some stuff from Hawaii, from just, they knew it's 39-year-old basalt. Came back as 8.5 million years old in terms of the age.
So Dave, go back to that real fast. So to me, as I'm listening to this, is there the problem with the actual method or process of radiometric dating, or those analyzing that, and is there somehow bias based on this old earth of billions of years old,
Yeah.
or a creationist view of younger? Because to me, that Christian that would hold to the shorter period of time or whatever would never even think of putting those numbers out
Right.
there. So is that...
Well, I think the bias would be if they knew where they came from, they would come up with an age that fits that to show that the dating fits it. But because it was a blind test and they didn't know where the rock samples came from, they ran them through their tests and they came back with these crazy numbers, and it just shows that there's a flaw in understanding those three assumptions: the starting level, the rate of decay, and then was there any kind of other impacts on that over time. And the dating methodology has flaws in it. But we're told it's an axiom.
It's quite a range, too. I mean, 340,000 to 2.8 million.
I mean, can you imagine as a financial economist if I came out sometime and said my jobs forecast for next quarter is somewhere between 340,000 and 2.8 million jobs? You would look at that and you'd say, you have a PhD and do this? I mean that's not a forecast. That's just, it's ridiculous, right? The other big one is the cosmic microwave background. And this is all presented as if it's evidence from the Big Bang. It's the original light that's gone out from the original point of singularity when the Big Bang happened. And they go ahead and they measure the light and the speed of it. And yet one of the problems they have out there is that the temperatures out there in space, regardless of where you go and how far you go, is consistently the 454 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 270 centigrade. And there's no explanation because the temperature should be different. And the distant light theory is always the idea that God would never, ever have created the universe already in action. He would have only been able to do it from a starting point. And that's why, again, most Christian theistic evolutionists have adopted the secular Big Bang view to say that that's how God created. It was a Big Bang, and that's what we see. But there are other very plausible explanations for why we see what appears to be the Earth, the universe is still expanding, and yet it also places where it looks like it's contracting. There's also issues about the distant light we see. Some will argue, well, God would never have created the light already in transit, so that can't possibly happen. Well, take that same thinking back to human beings. That means he would never have created a fully mature man named Adam and a fully mature woman named Eve who could have offspring. He would have started with, what, embryos? Well, where would they have been carried? In what uterus in order that they could be born? So when he says that all of a sudden the seas were teeming with life, the sky was filled with birds, the animals were all over the planet, is that an opinion that they all started as microbes and then evolution over time filled up? Or is our God big enough that he spoke it?
I was going to say, that's a small God problem.
Yeah, exactly. Think about it. A small God would say, well, I was able to get evolution going, then I had to sit back and watch it happen for a couple billion years. Or the big God can say, what? I just spoke it into being. And another quick one is the warm primordial pool. That it was just this nice temperature of mush, and all of a sudden lightning hit it at 4 billion years ago, and suddenly, voila, proteins and peptides all of a sudden, and amino acids, and all the building blocks for life were there, and in time, some little person crawled out of there, a little animal or something, a little fish or something, or some simple cell. Well, simple cells, I can show you books on Amazon on cellular biology that are 600 pages with 47 chapters on the simple cell. Yeah. Okay? And then finally, DNA. There are so many great books written on the discovery of DNA and how they broke the code and everything, and yet they ultimately fall on, isn't it amazing how it evolved? And it's so complex. The strands in your body of DNA on the double helix approach millions of miles of DNA in each person's body. And in there is all the code for your eye color, your hair color, your skin, how you'll grow. Everything is in there. And it's all from the two people that produced you. And they pass it down in the DNA. And yet everything about it is viewed as, oh, we uncovered this amazing evolutionary axiom of the building blocks of life. And so they take language that is very philosophical and they apply it to science. And I'll close with this on this section, but Ian Malcolm is the character that Jeff Goldblum plays in the movie Jurassic Park, and you know how he always, he's literally the spokesperson in the movie for the naturalist, scientific, evolutionist worldview when he says, well, life breaks free. Life expands to new territories, painfully, perhaps even dangerously, but life finds a way. And that was the classic line, life always finds a way. And that's a fanciful philosophical statement, but that's what it is. It's philosophy. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think your Jeff Goldblum impersonation needs a little work, but besides that, no. Some of what I want to say. So, again, for me, one of the things that I do in talks that I give. So my most recent book is to talk about doubt and how to handle doubt, how to sort of walk our way through it, because my story is one in which I found myself in a really deep season of doubt. It was actually in seminary, which you might think that's an odd place to doubt your faith, but it's actually quite common for seminary students to doubt. And I was just in the throes of doubt, and I leaned in and found answers. And so my story is one of saying that what we need to be doing, I think, as Christians, again, as loving God with all of our mind, not as skeptics trying to trip God up, or not try to be, troublemakers or whatever, but just honestly asking questions as they come, and as we lean in, we're gonna struggle a little bit, and that's okay. I always tell my teenagers and I tell my students, man, that's just part of the picture. The fact that we're so kind of adverse to doubt is just because we probably haven't really embraced that lifestyle of really asking the deep and difficult questions, because when you do, you're just going to have some struggles as you go. And so, like I said, I think that there is evidence, there are some data, there are some things that we may come across that can present some tension for our Christian beliefs.
Yes.
Okay, I was going to gauge the reaction there. I just think that's a fact, that you could find yourself sitting in an evolutionary biology classroom and presenting, and I think sometimes students feel kind of lied to when they just are told, this is just obvious, I always can't stand, probably shouldn't say this because maybe some of you have this bumper sticker, but the Christian fish eating the Darwin thing or whatever, because I think some students, they just sort of grapple with these challenges and feel lied to, and that's why when they find themselves in the throes of doubt, they're out. Whereas for me, it was for the very first time, I realized that I don't know that Christianity is true in that moment, but I also didn't know it was false. And so why would I walk away there? It's too early. It's premature to walk away. I have to lean in and find answers. And so what I think we all have to do is be truth seekers most fundamentally, right? As Christians, we should be seeking the truth. The way I describe it in the book is to have the posture of a truth seeker as we ask our questions, just out of a deep curiosity and trying to find the truth. And so here comes some scientific challenge, let's say. Now, what I have found to be very, very helpful in this, as we face down some challenge, is to make a distinction between scientific data and scientific theory. Mm-hmm. Is the Bible in tension with scientific theory and probably incompatible? I mean, not probably, definitely incompatible with some scientific theories? Yeah, absolutely. But I would submit to you, I would suggest that the Bible is not, I think it's actually complementary with scientific data. So let me make the distinction. So data are the facts that are observed. That's what we see in, say, a scientific experiment in the lab, or if we're doing field observations, those sorts of things. That's the raw data. And then what scientists do, as we should, we do this in life, right? We will try to understand what's there, interpret what's there, and theorize about what's there. But you've got to let the data drive the ship, so to speak, or sail the ship. I don't know, whatever metaphor. Drive the car. Because, right, this just happens in normal life. So if I'm thinking I left the keys on the coffee table, And then here comes the coffee table, no keys, right? The data is what's most important there, not my theory. We don't want to stick to our theories when it's out of step with the data. And I think what I would say as Christians, what we do, we've got a sort of a wider data set, right? What we're trying to do is take both what science has to say in terms of the data, again, not so worried about the theories and the interpretation of the data and so on, but the data, and ask these big questions about the Bible and say, are we able to reconcile these two? And again, I think that you can, because here's like an example of it, okay? So they say that we share 98.8% of our genetic code or material with chimpanzees. Data. Theory, we're cousins. We're related. There's a common ancestor that makes sense of that shared genetic data. But notice that theory doesn't follow. It's not entailed by that, right? It's a fact that we share that genetic code, but it doesn't follow that therefore we're cousins. That's just the way in which scientists have tried to make sense of it. And again, like not without reason. I think there's some bit of plausibility to that, for sure. But when we take a broader data set and we say, well, why couldn't it be that God just created us that way? Right? We have a big God. We could say that God just had a purpose and a plan. And what would his purpose and plan be? Well, again, intellectual humility. But I would say maybe it's that God wants us to feel an affinity with animals, right? As stewards of the world, as caretakers of animals and the world, as he set us up to be, Genesis again, right, is going to be the place in which we find that. Maybe there's a sense in which we share genetic, traits in order to have a sort of affinity that we would care for them as having that affinity. So I don't know, but I'm just saying, like, that's a theory too. So we can reconcile that data because, again, I'm going to start with the existence of God, and then I'm going to look to see what story best explains the existence of God. I come down on Christianity, and I see that the Bible has these things to say. So if the Bible is God's inspired word, then I'm going to, sort of take that as part of my data set. And I'm going to look at all the data to say, where do I end up? And here again, what I say is that the data of science is not contrary to the Bible. Okay, but what do we do? What do we do when we run across something? Now, here's the reality, and I'm stealing this from John Lennox. He does this great bit on being a fixed earther. Anybody a fixed earther? Here, right? Probably none of us. I thought your hand went up. Any fixed? She scratched her head on it. She almost became a fixed earther. No fixed earthers here, right? Now the Bible says that in numerous places. 1 Chronicles 16:30 says, "He has fixed the earth firm and immovable." Psalm 93 says, "Thou hast fixed the earth immovable and firm." Psalm 104 says, "The fixed earth on its foundations." Right now, what was the big controversy in the time of Galileo and all that? The so-called Galileo affair was that he was proposing a moving earth, not a fixed earth. And people thought, that seems to be out of step with Scripture. But again, none of us. So what do we do when we find some bit of data? I think rightly we go back to Scripture and ask if now notice, theories about the Bible, our interpretation of the Bible is out of step with the data of the Bible, right? So it's, again, we go back to that distinction between data and theory, and I think there are going to be times in which we take a closer look and look at the biblical data and say, are we committed to the idea that the earth is the center of the solar system? That it's not moving and everything moves around it? Or is the Bible, the biblical data, again, now it's out of step with our theory, but the biblical data, is it able to be interpreted in a way that can make good on that scientific data? And that's where we've all come out. So I think when it comes to something like evolution and it comes to something like the age of the universe, that's the process that we want to be in, is looking at the biblical data and just saying, okay, my theory might be young earth, my theory might be no evolution. Am I reading the Bible in the way in which the Bible presents itself?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
When you think about, sure, when you think about, science interpreting Genesis, that's a different lens. It's a different worldview. It's a different perspective. Probably one of the big topics that we'll kind of wrap up this morning's issue on Genesis with is we looked at a little bit of creation, but think about the global flood. It really divides people into various camps. One is it's just myth. The other is, well, there was a flood of Noah, but it was localized. It was the world as they knew it. So it was right in and around Mesopotamia, Eastern Mediterranean Sea area. We would expect to see a flood right there, but it wasn't global in the sense of the entire globe. And then there's a camp that says, well, the Bible says God would never again flood the earth. Well, wait a minute, there's been all kinds of floods since then. So I always love to show, we always have a picture of the earth in our minds. This is a perspective of how earth looks if you are at a different angle. Is a global flood all that ridiculous when you look at the planet from this standpoint? Right? I mean, think about that. How many of you have ever thought of Earth, and this is the picture you have, a little slice of Australia and the coast of California and Baja, right? 97% of all the water on our planet is saline. That supports the fact that the entire planet has been, at one time or other, covered in salt water. Only 3% is fresh water. Think about that. And is that consistent with a global flood? Some of the latest archaeology sites that are being explored in and around Turkey in Ararat. Remember, it didn't say that the ark landed on Mount Ararat. It said it landed on the mountains of Ararat, which can be the range. And just about 18 miles from the peak, there's a new site that has been really, really popular. Obviously, Turkey isn't open to anybody who'd like to go and start digging, but there are archaeologists who are ready to take a look at this site in Dura Pinar, and they're saying that some of the early tests there could be that it's a fossilized vessel that is buried there in the sediment. And there's been studies done that compare Noah's Ark to the Titanic in terms of would it be seaworthy. Another favorite one I've looked at is the Korean Institute for Ships and Engineering, which is called KRISE. They actually had maritime engineers take the exact specs from Genesis and say, let's build one out and see what it would look like. And they came back and said the draft, which is how it sits in the water and what the water line comes up to, its ability to float, its ability to stay on the water for a year, have enough food for 8 individuals plus all those animals. And remember, the animals weren't, 4-ton elephants and stuff. You could have small animals, babies of everything. And you could have virtually everything in there. And look at all the decks, look at all the ways things could be done. And again, they looked at it and said, it's plausible. It's not a story whereby if you tested it with some good scientific explanations of engineering and structural engineering for seaworthy vessels and all, that it would fall apart because it's ridiculous. And how about what they find? I mean, look at these 2 fossils on the left. They were found in the Himalayas. Okay, and all the water that's up there right now, all the lakes and everything, where there's these, there aren't, right? Why would there be sea fossils at 26,000 feet up? You have a fish that's eating another fish, and the naturalist worldview says that fossils are created over billions of years. But if a carcass lays out on a rock, it's going to be eaten by all the scavengers who come in and ultimately scattered. But we find whole, full skeletons that look like they were just moving whatever they were doing, and instantly were inundated with tons and tons and tons of pressure and debris that instantly fossilized them. I'll just say it. These 2 on the right-hand side here, these are 2 turtles that are mating, and they were fossilized in process. And again, how could that happen? They were alive. They were obviously, alive when this happened, and it looks like they were buried instantaneously. And when they found the fossilized turtles, they said, how could that be that they would be in that state? You've probably read or heard about the mammoths in Siberia that were found, looked like they were instantly buried quickly and rapidly. and they still had food in their stomach and food in the mouth, and then flash frozen. And again, that's not something that died and laid there for millennia and slowly decayed. But these were, they have evidence that they were buried very, very quickly.
So Dave, within the fossil record then, you're saying that it was some sudden catastrophic event.
That's what it appears to be.
And there's no in-between in terms of the evolution of the fossils within the fossil record?
Right. And that's a problem.
Okay, so what about the other ancient accounts of the flood?
Yeah.
Like you've got the Epic of Gilgamesh. People would congregate around fresh water. That's what you do. There's rivers, and those rivers would flood, and people have accounts of those floods. But then there's the global flood. And from a biblical perspective, if that flood was to punish the earth, it wouldn't have been local. It would have been worldwide.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
But what do we do with those other ancient accounts? Do you think they were recording the same event, or do you think it was more of a localized interpretation of what was happening?
Yeah, we don't know, but the Epic of Gilgamesh and others in Latin America and other places seem to be that the oral tradition was passed down over time, that there was a flood. Think about it. Noah, his 3 sons, and the 4 women, the wives, came out of the ark. And would that tradition be passed down all through the years? And people would know about the flood. That would, and as societies branched out from Babel and so forth, you would expect to find those kinds of records and those kinds of accounts.
And those in the biblical account versus these others, those are based on myth. These are mythical figures, not historical persons.
Exactly.
Which is the account of Genesis.
And they could, again, different societies, different cultures could try to merge those into their own cultures. Real quickly, some last things. Some of the same sediment that we see in Grand Canyon and in Wyoming is from the same source. How did that sediment end up thousands of miles apart in different cliffs? How do you end up with the Grand Canyon layers with all kinds of fossils in there of sea life? We're told that the Colorado River has been carving it out for billions of years, and yet it looks like, as we say, it is either a lot of catastrophe in a short amount of time, or it was a really slow process. We also see, which defies the idea of gradual sediment over time, we see all kinds of rock layers all around the world that are bent. That means they would have to be viscous, they would have to be soft, they would have to be permeable at a time when the flood was raging and all of a sudden the waters are starting to settle, and whole sections of cliff sides actually go up and come back down, and that flies right in the face of natural gradual sedimentation over time. This is right from the Smithsonian Magazine from April of 2000. The researchers said it appears that the Mediterranean roared into the Black Sea about 5,000 years ago. Boy, that fits very, very nicely with the idea that there was a global flood. And I'll just end with this. When you think about Genesis and the flood, I'm back to my numbers again. This is how I think of things. But I took these right out of anthropology books. One says in 50,000 BC, there were 30,000 Homo sapiens, not quite human, but Homo sapiens. And if you take a 0.25% growth rate of population, which is really small, really, really slow, just 0.25% per year, there would be 8 billion people on the planet in 5,000 years. So that means that at 45,000 BC, there'd already be 8 billion. That's how many we have on the planet today, 8 billion people. We passed it about a year ago. If you came out just to 7,500 years from 50,000 BC, there'd be 4 trillion people on the planet at 42,500 BC. Think about that. 4 trillion. How about this? I took this from another textbook. It said in 8,000 BC, there were 5 million humans. We know this. This is how they present it. There were 5 million humans in 8,000 BC. Apply the same growth rate. You get to 8 billion people, our current population, you'd get to them in about 2,900 years. That would mean that there'd be 1.32 trillion people in 5,000 years at 3,000 BC. And at the time of Jesus, there would be 2.367 quadrillion people on the planet. And they have no explanation for this. They try to say things like, oh, well, the populations grew and grew and grew, and then they all died off except for 4. And then they all grew and grew and grew again, and they have these theories And you look at it and you say, that doesn't make any sense. Can you imagine getting to the time of Jesus, there's 2.367 quadrillion people living on the planet? Okay? But how about this last one? Noah's flood was around 2484 BC, about middle of the third millennium BC. And it's about 4,500 years ago. If you had 8 people come out of the ark and the population growth rate was pretty much in line with the National Institutes of Health that show that the global population seems to have been the last 150 years or so, just under 0.5% per year. Well, if you take 8 people and go 0.5% per year for 4,900 years or 4,500 years, you come out to a population today of 8 billion. Think about that. Which is more plausible? The 50,000 BC, 30,000 Homo sapiens, the 8,000 BC, 5 million humans, or the Noah's flood that 8 people come out of the ark and 4,500 years later there's 8 billion people on the planet? That's a growth rate of less than 0.5% per year. Is that plausible? It's incredibly plausible. In fact, it fits with the data. And yet we're told that it's a myth or a story. So, Travis, I'm always interested in my colleagues who are into theistic evolution. Why don't you give us a couple minutes on that?
Yeah, so theistic evolution, sometimes called evolutionary creationism. So you just flip.
That's a nice oxymoron.
Yeah, well,
I'm biased.
You've got God creating, right? So he creates the heavens and the earth and so on. But then evolution really kind of takes over from there. And again, I might just point out that what I worry about is that we are kind of trying to fit the Bible into a more scientifically respectable, category in some way. And I'm just not sure what the motivation is there. I'm not sure what the belief would be in a way, right? Because again, if sorry if I'm making that noise. If the Bible, one of the most fundamental things to get figured out is what do you say about the Bible, right? I said that about, we got to figure out what we say about God, what sort of God. These are these big worldview questions that we have to get figured out. And I really think watershed moment is what you say about the Bible. Because if the Bible is God's inspired word, if God is the principal author of the Bible, then we've got an account. We've got an account written by the author himself, whereas science, science gives us so much that we should be so thankful for, but especially as it relates to worldview, it kind of stumbles its way through, right? Lots of gaps, lots of holes, lots of ways in which science is just not the right kind of methodology in order to arrive at these things. And so if we have an account by the author himself, why wouldn't we prioritize that in trying to figure out how the world is designed? And then again, as we look at the data of science, we wondered, are there ways in which this is a problem? Are there ways in which this is complementary? And I think what we see, even that last bit that Dave, you were just talking about with the population growth and things like that, that's a data versus theory issue again, right? So that the data actually supports the biblical view strongly in some ways. And I think that's pretty powerful. But I think where it really comes down to us for Christians is, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but is where are the red lines? How much, well, I guess I'm just giving my question that I'm going to give at the end, but how much flexibility is there? How much can we sort of say, Christians are coming out on this place, and this place, and so on. And I've got some dear friends that are theistic evolutionists, and this isn't meant to be a put down at all, but I just think, I think it, for me, crosses some theological red lines. For me, the red line has to do with the gospel.
Yes.
It has to do with the gospel. And whether or not there is a literal Adam and Eve. I think what the Bible says to us, I don't think you can mythologize this away or metaphor this away, is that God created the heavens and the earth. Again, most every Christian, at least, theist, is going to be okay with that. But I think that Genesis really does come down on the fact that God created throughout in a bit of a progression. Again, you might say 6 literal days. That's a progression, right? 6 days. He doesn't have to. Why would he have to take 6 days? He wouldn't have to, but he took, on that view, 6 literal days, or 6 very large swaths of time, or maybe you have some time sort of packed into the God's creating the heavens and the earth in the first little bit of Genesis 1, and then the days start, right? Sometimes people will say, look, maybe there's time that sort of expired there. There are a lot of views here, but I think what you have to say, to take the Bible seriously, is that God created specially, and then he especially created us specially. Yeah. As the sort of crescendo of the creation is the creation of Adam and Eve, of humanity, something very, very different than all the rest of creation, right? You think of the days, they all end with, and if you've been studying Genesis, right, you know this, it ends with God seeing that it was good, seeing that it was good, seeing that it was good. And then when humans are created, God says, God's word says that it was very good indeed. The CSB, I think, puts it really nicely, that it's very good indeed. So this is the crescendo. We are created in God's image. And man, talk about a big philosophical, theological issue that should, sort of capture our attention maybe for the rest of our lives, is trying to figure out what it all means for us to be created in the image of God. It gives a dignity to you and I, not just you and I, but all those out there, no matter if people are cursing God's name or not, they still bear the image of God. It's just, a sort of worldview game changer in a way, to see human beings as created in God's image. And you really only get that from a serious study of Genesis. And I think if you have theistic evolution, you have a problem. How do you get humans created specially? Right? How does the image bearing come about if we're cousins and we've just sort of slowly evolved from, say, chimpanzees or whatever? But I think you ultimately have a gospel problem.
Yes.
Because in Romans 5, it's said very, very explicitly, it seems to be the case that Paul himself, in writing Romans 5, has a literal Adam in mind, a literal man in mind. He says this, he says in verse 12, "Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, in this way death spread to all people because all sinned. In fact, sin was in the world before the law, but the sin was not charged to a person's account when there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from, notice, Adam to Moses, even over those who did not." So and then dropping down to 15, "But the gift is not like the trespass, for if by one man's trespass the many died, how much more have the grace of God and the gift which comes through the grace of one man, Jesus Christ, overflowed to the many," right? So it's, in order to understand this good news, there's got to be the bad news. There's got to be the fact that there's a fall. Otherwise, you've got a problem of evil that can't be solved, I think. If God created the world with sin in it already, you know what I mean? Just sort of being passed on from species to species, or however it works on that viewed, you need a literal fall. I would suggest, in order to solve the problem of evil, we have to say that God created the world and it was good. It was very good indeed. And then it's us who have sinned. It's Adam and Eve who have sinned. They were created free in order to choose sin, and they chose sin. Otherwise, you have God as the author of sin, and I think that's a very big theological problem. And then again, you need that actual literal fall in order to make sense of the one man coming to save us in grace, right? Dying on the cross and defeating death in the resurrection.
Yeah, and what's so beautiful about Orthodox Christianity, in Genesis 1:26, it literally says, "Let us make man in our image." These are plural, pronouns here, meaning the triune God, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, has always existed. And as Travis had mentioned last night in Genesis, in John 1, in the beginning was the Word, the Logos, was with God, the Word was God. You go to what Paul has to say in Colossians, All things were created by him, through him, for him, Christ. And the fact that this triune God's always existed, and that because of the sins of mankind, God sent prophets to warn. He sent judgment. There were consequences to the sin and the actions, so much so that there was a global flood, a punishment. And yet people still try to obey God. They still turned away. And God knew the remedy all along would be to enter creation of Christ, the invisible becoming visible in Jesus Christ. And tomorrow night, that's who we're talking about. We're going to talk about Jesus, the historical Jesus, his birth, his death on a Roman cross, and the resurrection, because as Paul says, without it, we're really doomed. Mm-hmm. And we can only go back to these different theories.
And think about it, as we close here, Travis brings up a great point, is that from Romans 5, why is the language in Genesis metaphor and the name Adam is a people group or several eons or something, and yet Paul's writing about, he uses the term, this one man. Mm-hmm. In this one man, sin entered the world. There are 7 other passages in the New Testament that speak specifically about the man Adam, and even about Eve and how she was created from him. And so again, you have either a big discord between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the book of Moses and the Torah, and what's going on in the New Testament. And you also have a language issue that undermines the gospel. And now granted, a secular scientist, a naturalist, an atheist, an evolutionist is going to say, well, it's not a problem for me because I don't believe the Bible at all. Right. What do you say?
It's a problem for a Christian who's trying to work these views into their theological
Absolutely.
position. And by the way, some of those references are by Jesus himself. So Jesus refers to seemingly a literal Adam and Eve.
Yes.
So unless you think Jesus got it wrong,
yeah,
and we should have a conversation if you do, right? You've got bigger theological issues there than, right? I think you have this biblical problem if you're denying a literal Adam and a literal Eve.
Yeah, and so again, it comes down to convenience. If your bias, if your naturalist worldview is already in place, you are compelled to interpret everything through it. And so you're going to, even if you are, let's say, a Christian who has gone to a top university and gotten a degree in chemistry, biology, physics, something like that, you're going to find that the faculty there are going to compel you as well to adopt the prevailing paradigm of that university and of the academy, which is that evolution is how things happen, 13.8 billion years, this is how it occurred. And you're going to be in this wrestling inside.
You're saying universities are biased? What?
And you're going to be trying to figure out, how do I reconcile that with my faith? So that's the whole basis for what we see in theistic evolution, is an attempt to go back to Genesis and to say, well, I'm okay with Genesis 50, 49, 48, 47, 46, all the way down to Genesis chapter 9 as being literal, because those are places on the planet. They're real people. The ages are years. They're not aeons. When it says day, and the Hebrew word is yom, that means a day. But then you get to chapter 9, and you go to chapter 8, chapter 6. Those first 8 chapters, you suddenly feel then compelled to say, gosh, I have to jettison my Christian worldview because I have to find a way to interpret this that fits with my naturalist worldview that I've been promoted with. And so that's where the tension comes. And again, in an hour and 25 minutes, we aren't able to give you everything. We had originally 174 slides, and we had to cut a few out. So these guys were reeling me in and said, we have to let them go before 3 p.m. So, but again, our desire on something like this is to prompt you, to kind of spur you on, to get you thinking, and to have you say, you know what, go find some good resources. So here are some good resources. And these aren't even the exhaustive list of resources. These are some that I like. And of course, there's even guys like Richard Dawkins. It's good to read if your faith is strong. Read his God Delusion from 2008. You can get a PDF online, and you see a strong bias that comes in. He's already made up his mind there cannot be a God. And so then everything is interpreted through that lens. But then you have other authors on here I think one that's most interesting is one of the most famous astrophysicists, Fred Hoyle, actually comes out and talks about an intelligent universe. And so, and yet they're wrestling with the idea that even as an atheist or not as a Christian, the universe, the natural world, seems to exhibit design. Earth seems to look like it's been finely tuned for life. And it's always sad when we're told by the other side, you're not allowed to use those words. I say, but that's how I see it. It looks finely tuned. I mean, we just gave you little overviews of some of these topics. And especially for the ladies on Thursday morning, as you go through Genesis with Debbie for the weeks and weeks coming up the rest of this year, think about how you read Genesis and through what lens do you look at that. And is there anything in there, anything at all, that is completely contrary to what we know about science? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't think that there is. I do think, even looking at some of this list here, again, I do think, so this is kind of my question that we were going to get to. Is that what we're doing now?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. There is latitude. Like, I do think we can disagree about some things. I hope that's okay to say that in church. Right? Okay, good. And I think the age of the earth, I think, so on my view, I'm actually agnostic on that issue. I really don't know. And I'm really comfortable saying that. I just don't know how old the earth is, how old the universe is. I hear some of these arguments and I think, definitely young earth. And then I talk to some of my old earth friends and I think, definitely old earth, right? I feel myself kind of pulled in that way where I just say, I'm very comfortable to say I just don't know on the exact age. I'm convinced of this, that the Bible doesn't tell us. It doesn't give us an exact age, right? And I think we should all agree with that. Again, data versus theory. We read the Bible and that will kind of form our theories about the age of the earth, and we should. Absolutely should. I'm just at a place where I don't know, and I'm really comfortable saying that. And that's not trying to like sidestep the issues. I just honestly don't know because I find both to be quite compelling. I think the idea that God created the earth very much in a mature state makes a lot of sense to me, and I think that you can make sense of a lot of the kind of data like that the stars that we see in the sky, would take millions, if not billions of years to arrive at Earth. God could have just created those, kind of beams of light in process. I don't have any problem with that. But then I would admit that there's a lot of things about the universe that looks old.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of torn there. So I think there's latitude. But like I said, I really think it comes down to taking Genesis seriously, understanding what things are claimed there, what things we do, like the Bible is telling us is true, things like God's creation, the image of God, that he's creating specially and something of a progression in his creative acts. Like those to me are the sort of non-negotiables. Those are the red lines. But lots of other latitude to just sort of, and if somebody really did kind of take their evolutionary views, like I don't find it plausible, but I know a lot of very, what I would call faithful Christians who hold to an evolutionary view. They're out there. And it's okay. Again, I think they have some biblical issues, and I think there's lots of ways to challenge that, but I know people that's just where they've landed, and I think we shouldn't see this as a battle or a war where we're going to turn people out if they dare hold to any sort of, and again, I might not be exactly where these guys are at in that, and that's just showing that we should be able to have some latitude to go, again, be truth seekers fundamentally, that we are in the posture of a truth seeker, just out of our curiosity, asking these questions, and as we try to interpret the data as well as we can, right, we're just at where we're at.
Todd, what's another good question that a typical person might ask with regard to Genesis and origins and Noah's flood and so forth?
Well, I think it's really important to keep in mind that it's not my view of an old earth or a young earth that's going to save me from my ultimate problem for each one of us. And that is that we live in a fallen, broken world. We're sinners among sinners. And each one of us is guilty of that sin and therefore separated from God. And yet this God who created entered in the form of Jesus, the God-man, fully human, that lived a life that you and I could never live. He was tempted in every way, and yet he never sinned. And then he was completely innocent and yet hung on a cross between two thieves by Roman execution to bear the sins, to bear our sins, yours and mine. And because of that, and not just because that was prophesied for so many hundreds of years earlier, but it fulfilled those things, but yet the fact that he rose from the dead as he said that he would, proving that he's more powerful than sin and death, and the fact that it's not what we can do, but it's what he has done. You know, there's no one in this room can earn salvation. Grace is unmerited favor. It's a free gift. It doesn't matter where you live, who your parents are, how much money you make, how popular you are. It's all about Jesus and what he has done. And I think that is what we have to keep at the forefront of our minds when we're discussing these topics, because we can get sidetracked. And as Travis has said, people can be divided over this to the point where they think, oh, so you believe it's a young earth? Well, you must not be a Christian. Mm-hmm. Are you an old earth? Or you think that God's bigger than that. And I think we're guessing at a lot of it, but these are educated guesses is hopefully what we're getting at, is that we're actually looking at the evidence and the science, and we're looking at the scriptures as being inspired by God to say, how does this go together and how do we make sense of it all?
Yep. And I would close with this, is just think in terms of, is the Genesis account plausible? Is there anything in there when you read it, you just go, okay, I'm fine with the top 10 topics, but there's this 11th topic in Genesis that just could not have happened. And you suddenly say to yourself, everything in there is plausible. And that's why we gave you 3 or 4 slides about Noah's Ark and so forth. I mean, I have 2.5-hour presentations just on the flood and the evidence around the globe on that. And it's overwhelming to have real solid Christian geologists take you through all the different stuff on the planet that fully reflects a massive inundation of salt water all throughout the planet. I mean, in the middle of Kansas, there are all these trilobites and so forth, these little crustaceans and all kinds of sea animals buried in the fossil record. We haven't even gotten around to the discussion of the dinosaurs. There's so many things, but I would encourage you that there's nothing in Genesis that when you read it, you would say, well, that's just not even possible. And because again, we're not reading about Middle Earth, we're not reading about Atlantis, we're not reading about Shangri-La, we're reading about real places. I mean, to think that, I'll say this last comment, to think that the account says the ark rested on the mountains of Ararat. Can you imagine if it said the mountains rested on some mountains we've never heard of? No one knows anything about them, where they happen to be, and it's just this, no, it's Ararat. And interestingly enough, it's in Turkey. And interestingly enough, Turkey has not allowed the whole world for decades to go in and just start doing all kinds of digs and checking things out. There's satellite photography you can find on the web about people who think that they've located the ark. There's been accounts in the last 35, 40 years of guys who have trekked to a fossilized, what seems to be a wooden structure that's there on the ice in the mountains up at 12,000, 14,000 feet. All those kinds of things. All I'm getting at with that is you won't find anything that literally comes back and says it could not have happened that way. There's plenty of evidence that says, oh, the full account could have happened. And I love what Travis always brings up is the God of the Bible is what would you expect from a God who could speak the creation into being? Yeah. You would expect some pretty amazing things. He's not made up of molecules. He doesn't live and exist inside his own creation like you and I. He's not subject to time. He's not mass accelerating through space and at a certain rate, and there's time. He's outside of time. And so what would you expect from somebody with that kind of power and that kind of ability? You would expect to see amazing things. And that's why you would expect to see the diversity of plant life, animal life, the trees, all the fruits and vegetables, all the animals, all of the insects, all the birds, all the different fish. And yet you come down to the special revelation, the special creation of mankind, and how he puts that as his crowning achievement. And again, it's not a people group. It's a man, it's a woman, and you see a lineage from that carries on right through Genesis and right into today, and takes you right down to the records that we have. So we'll be available to chat with you. I'll leave this up on the screen. We do have books from the Apologetics series are out in the lobby, and you're welcome to grab some if you haven't had a chance to look through some of those. But if you have more questions, we're happy to chat with you for a little while. And again, thank you so much for coming. And if you are available, tomorrow evening at 7 o'clock, we'll be right in here for our final session. We're taking a look at the historical Jesus. Is there a case that there really was a historical Jesus? Did he actually get crucified by the Romans? And what about the resurrection? And how do you explain that? And so we'll do that tomorrow at 7 o'clock, okay? All right, thanks for coming.